There is a moment in every emotionally exhausting relationship when a person finally stops chasing. Not because they stopped caring, but because they realized something dangerous. The harder they tried to hold the connection together, the more invisible they became. And this is where the psychology changes. Most people think avoidants are cold, detached, unaffected. But behavioral psychology tells us something very different. Avoidants are not emotionless. They are emotionally defensive. There is a massive difference. An avoidant person often learned very early that emotional closeness can feel overwhelming, unpredictable, or unsafe. Instead of running toward emotional intensity, they run away from it. Not always physically. Sometimes mentally. Sometimes emotionally. Sometimes through silence, distance, distraction, or emotional shutdown. Now here is where most people make the mistake. When the avoidant pulls away, they chase harder. They text more, explain more, overanalyze, more. Try to prove their loyalty. Try to prove their love. Try to convince the avoidant to stay emotionally connected. But from a behavioral perspective, pressure rarely creates safety. Pressure creates resistance. And every emotional pursuit unintentionally confirms the avoidant's deepest fear. Closeness will consume me. So what happens when you stop? What happens when you let them ignore you? That is when the emotional dynamic completely changes. Because human beings adapt to emotional patterns. If someone is used to your constant reassurance, your constant attention, your emotional availability, your silence becomes psychologically noticeable. Not because silence is manipulation, but because contrast creates awareness. The avoidant expects emotional pursuit. They expect another message, another emotional explanation, another attempt to reconnect. And when it does not happen, something unusual occurs. The nervous system loses predictability. This creates psychology, tension. Now suddenly, the avoidant has space. And space is dangerous for someone who avoids emotional reflection. Because without distraction, awareness appears. This is when delayed emotions often begin surfacing, not immediately. Avoidants are rarely immediate processors. Their emotions often arrive late. While you were emotionally overwhelmed in real time, they were emotionally disconnected in real time. But later comes the comparison, the curiosity, the emotional inventory. They begin remembering the emotional safety you provided, the consistency, the patience, the attention. And most importantly, they notice the absence of access. Now understand this carefully. This is not about winning. This is not about emotional games. If your goal is revenge, manipulation, or punishment, you are still emotionally trapped inside the dynamic. Real power is emotional detachment from unhealthy patterns. When you stop chasing, something deeper happens inside you. You stop abandoning yourself. That changes your body language, your energy, your confidence, your decisions. And psychologically, people respond differently to those who respect themselves. The avoidant especially notices this shift. Why? Because avoidants are highly sensitive to pressure, dependency, and emotional intensity. But when someone becomes emotionally grounded instead of emotionally reactive, the avoidant often becomes more curious. Not because you became colder, but because you became emotionally stable. This is the part many people misunderstand. Avoidants are not always running from people. Many times, they are running from emotional exposure. And when you constantly chase them, you unintentionally remove the need for them to emotionally confront themselves. Your pursuit becomes their escape route, but your absence? That removes the distraction. Now they must sit with uncertainty. Now they must sit with emotional contrast. Now they must sit with the realization. Not that your attention was never guaranteed. And this is where growth becomes possible. For both people, you begin rebuilding your identity outside the relationship. You sleep better, think clearer. Stop obsessing over every delayed reply. Stop measuring your worth through someone else's emotional availability. That is freedom. And ironically, emotional freedom is often what creates the strongest psychological attraction. Not desperation. Not emotional overperformance. Not begging to be valued. Calm confidence. Self-control. Emotional independence. Those qualities change the entire interaction. Now, sometimes the avoidant returns. Sometimes they reach out. Sometimes they test the emotional door. Sometimes they suddenly become more interested once they no longer feel chased. But this is the critical moment. Do not confuse attention with transformation. Temporary curiosity is not the same as emotional growth. A truly healthy relationship requires accountability, communication, emotional regulation, and mutual effort. Not just chemistry, not just attachment, not just emotional intensity. And this is why your focus should never be, how do I make the avoidant suffer? The real question is, how do I stop suffering inside a one-sided emotional cycle? That question changes everything. Because the strongest position you can ever reach is not making someone regret losing you. It is reaching a point where your peace no longer depends on whether they stay. That is emotional maturity. That is self-respect. And psychologically, that is the moment the dynamic finally breaks. Avoidants fear emotional dependence more than most people realize, and this fear sits at the center of almost every confusing behavior they display in relationships. On the surface, they may appear calm, independent, emotionally detached, or even completely unaffected by connection. But underneath that exterior, many avoidant personalities experience a deep internal conflict. Part of, they genuinely want closeness, intimacy, loyalty, and emotional connection, while another part of them fears what emotional attachment might eventually cost them. This creates the exhausting push-pull dynamic that so many people experience when dealing with an avoidant individual. The avoidant nervous system often associates emotional dependence with danger rather than comfort. For some, this fear develops early in life when emotional needs were ignored, criticized, punished, or treated as weakness. Instead of learning that vulnerability creates safety and trust, they learn that closeness creates pressure, responsibility, disappointment, or loss of control. As a result, emotional self-protection becomes their survival strategy. They convince themselves that staying emotionally distant is safer than risking emotional exposure. This is why avoidants can sometimes appear deeply interested one moment and emotionally unavailable the next. When distance exists, they may crave intimacy and connection. They may pursue someone intensely, show affection, communicate consistently, and even appear emotionally open. But the closer the relationship becomes, the more emotionally exposed they begin to feel. Suddenly, vulnerability activates discomfort inside them. The relationship starts feeling less like excitement and more like emotional responsibility. That is often when withdrawal begins. This withdrawal is not always intentional cruelty. In many cases, it is an automatic defense mechanism. The avoidant person may stop texting as much, become emotionally cold, create unnecessary space, focus heavily on work or distractions, or suddenly claim they need freedom. Sometimes they convince themselves the relationship is moving too fast, becoming too serious, or demanding too much emotional energy. What they are truly reacting to is the fear of dependence itself. Dependence feels dangerous to them because dependence requires trust. It requires emotional surrender. It requires allowing another person to matter deeply. And for an avoidant personality, that level of emotional importance can feel terrifying. The more attached they become, the more vulnerable they feel to disappointment, rejection, criticism, or loss. Instead of leaning into intimacy, they often try to regain emotional control by creating distance. This creates confusion for the person on the receiving end. The partner often feels emotionally whiplashed. One day the avoidant seems loving, connected, and emotionally present. The next day they seem distant, distracted, or emotionally unreachable. The partner usually responds by chasing harder, seeking reassurance, asking for clarity, or trying to repair the connection. Unfortunately, this pressure often intensifies the avoidant's fear. The more emotionally pursued they feel, the more trapped their nervous system becomes. Ironically, avoidants are not always running away from love itself. Many are running away from the fear of losing themselves inside love. They fear becoming emotionally dependent on another person because dependence feels like vulnerability, and vulnerability feels unsafe. This is why they often struggle with consistency even when genuine feelings exist. Understanding this dynamic does not excuse unhealthy behavior, emotional neglect, or lack of accountability. But it does explain why avoidants behave in ways that appear contradictory. Deep down, many avoidants crave connection just like everyone else. The difference is that intimacy activates fear inside them at the same time it activates desire. And until they learn emotional security, self-awareness, and healthy vulnerability, they remain trapped between wanting closeness and fearing it at the exact same time. Chasing an avoidant usually strengthens their distance because the avoidant nervous system often interprets emotional pursuit as pressure rather than love. This is one of the most misunderstood dynamics in modern relationships. Most people naturally assume that if someone pulls away emotionally, the solution is to move closer, communicate more, reassure more, and fight harder for the connection. While that response may work in secure relationships, it often has the opposite effect with avoidant personalities. The more emotional intensity they feel directed toward them, the more their internal defense systems begin activating. Avoidants are highly sensitive to anything that feels emotionally overwhelming, emotionally demanding, or psychologically consuming. Even when the other person has good intentions, repeated attempts to fix the connection can create a sense of emotional suffocation inside the avoidant mind. This is because many avoidants associate closeness with pressure instead of safety. Their nervous system does not always separate love from emotional obligation. As a result, behaviors that seem caring to one person may feel intrusive or emotionally dangerous to them. This is why chasing rarely creates the outcome people hope for. When an avoidant becomes distant, many partners begin increasing emotional effort. They send longer messages, ask for reassurance, explain their feelings repeatedly, demand clarity, or try to emotionally reach the avoidant through persistence. The problem is that avoidants often process this emotional intensity as a threat to their independence and emotional control. Instead of feeling closer, they feel cornered. The avoidant nervous system values emotional space because space feels safe. Space allows them to regulate emotions without feeling emotionally exposed. When someone repeatedly pushes for emotional engagement during moments of withdrawal, the avoidant experiences increased internal discomfort. Their instinct is not usually to move closer under pressure. Their instinct is to escape the pressure entirely. This can lead to more silence, emotional shutdown, delayed responses, avoidance of serious conversations, or complete emotional detachment. Ironically, the sun chasing is usually acting from fear of losing the relationship, while the avoidant is withdrawing because they fear losing emotional freedom. Both people are reacting to fear, but in opposite directions. One moves closer, the other moves away. This creates the painful push-pull cycle that defines many anxious avoidant relationships. Over-explaining is another behavior that unintentionally strengthens distance. Many people believe that if they can just communicate clearly enough, emotionally enough, or passionately enough, the avoidant will finally understand their intentions. But avoidants often become emotionally overwhelmed by excessive emotional processing. Long emotional discussions can feel exhausting to them because vulnerability activates stress inside their nervous system. The more emotionally loaded the interaction becomes, the stronger their desire to retreat. This does not mean avoidants do not care. In many cases, they care deeply. But caring and emotional capacity are, not always the same thing. An avoidant may genuinely value the relationship while simultaneously lacking the emotional tools to tolerate intense emotional closeness consistently. Their withdrawal is often less about lack of feelings and more about emotional self-protection. What many people fail to realize is that emotional pursuit can accidentally remove accountability from the avoidant. When one person constantly chases, repairs, reassures, and reopens communication, the avoidant never fully experiences the emotional weight of their own distance. The dynamic becomes unbalanced. One person carries the emotional labor while the other controls proximity through withdrawal. This is why emotional calmness is often more effective than emotional pursuit. When pressure disappears, the avoidant no longer feels trapped. Space removes the immediate emotional threat their nervous system was reacting to. In that quieter environment, they may finally begin reflecting on the relationship without feeling emotionally cornered. Healthy connection with an avoidant requires emotional balance, patience, boundaries, and self-respect. Chasing someone who repeatedly withdraws often deepens the cycle rather than healing it. And sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is stop trying to force emotional closeness where emotional readiness does not yet exist. Silence creates psychological contrast because human beings quickly adapt to emotional patterns, especially inside relationships. Over time, people begin expecting certain reactions, certain emotional responses, and certain predictable behaviors from one another. In relationships involving avoidant personalities, this pattern often becomes extremely one-sided. The avoidant withdraws, becomes distant, delays communication, or emotionally disconnects, while the other person responds with emotional pursuit, reassurance, explanations, or attempts to reconnect. Eventually, this dynamic becomes predictable to both people, even if it is unhealthy. The avoidant unconsciously learns that distance will usually trigger pursuit. They expect emotional reactions. They expect another message, another attempt to fix the relationship, another emotional conversation, or another effort to restore closeness. Even when they complain about emotional intensity, part of their nervous system becomes accustomed to the certainty that the other person will remain emotionally available no matter how distant they become. This creates a hidden emotional structure within the relationship. That is why silence creates such a powerful psychological contrast. When the emotional pattern suddenly changes, the avoidant experiences something unfamiliar. Uncertainty. The predictable cycle disappears. The emotional reaction they unconsciously expected no longer arrives. Instead of receiving pursuit, they encounter space. Instead of emotional pressure, they encounter quiet. And psychologically, contrast creates awareness. Most people underestimate how much human attention is shaped by contrast. The mind notices changes more than constants. When emotional pursuit has been consistent for a long period of time, its absence becomes emotionally noticeable. The avoidant may not consciously admit this immediately, but their nervous system recognizes the shift. Something feels different. The emotional environment they became accustomed to is no longer functioning the same way. This silence is powerful not because it is manipulative, but because it interrupts emotional predictability. Predictability often allows avoidants to avoid deeper emotional reflection. If they know the other person will always chase, reassure, or reopen communication, they never fully have to confront the emotional consequences of their own withdrawal. The relationship continues operating on the same cycle. But when emotional reactions stop, the avoidant loses access to that familiar pattern. Now, for the first time, they may begin experiencing emotional rast directly. They notice the absence of attention. They notice the reduction in emotional availability. They notice the emotional quiet that replaced the constant pursuit. And in that silence, delayed emotional processing often begins. Avoidants frequently process emotions later rather than immediately. During emotional intensity, they often disconnect from their feelings in order to regulate internal discomfort. But once distance and silence create space, emotions sometimes rise to the surface slowly. Curiosity appears. Reflection appears. Comparison appears. They begin mentally revisiting the relationship without the distraction of ongoing emotional pressure. Silence also changes the emotional balance of the relationship. When one person constantly reacts emotionally, they unintentionally surrender emotional control to the avoidance behavior. Their mood becomes dependent on responses, attention, or reassurance. But when they stop reacting impulsively and regain emotional stability, they reclaim psychological balance. This shift can feel unfamiliar to the avoidant because the emotional dynamic no longer revolves around predictable pursuit and withdrawal. Importantly, silence is not about punishment, manipulation, or emotional games. Healthy silence is not silent treatment. It is emotional self-regulation. It is choosing not to overreact, over-explain, or abandon your own peace in order to force connection from someone emotionally unavailable. There is a major difference between mature emotional restraint and manipulative silence. When someone becomes emotionally grounded instead of emotionally reactive, they often appear stronger, calmer, and more self-respecting. Avoidants are highly sensitive to emotional pressure, but they also notice emotional stability. The absence of desperation changes the energy of the interaction completely. And this is why silence can become psychologically transformative. Not because it controls the avoidant, but because it disrupts. The unhealthy cycle both people became trapped inside. The avoidant loses the predictable emotional pattern they unconsciously relied on, while the other person finally begins reconnecting with their own emotional center. Sometimes that silence creates reflection in the avoidant. But even more importantly, it creates clarity in the person who finally stopped chasing. Emotional withdrawal activates curiosity because avoidants often do not process emotions in real time the way emotionally expressive people do. While others may immediately feel anxiety, sadness, longing, or emotional urgency during conflict or distance, avoidants frequently disconnect from those emotions in the moment. Their nervous system protects them by suppressing emotional intensity, minimizing vulnerability, or focusing on distractions instead of emotional reflection. This is why avoidants can sometimes appear calm, unaffected, or emotionally detached during situations that deeply impact the people around them. But emotional suppression is not the same as emotional absence. Many avoidants process emotions slowly and indirectly. Instead of fully experiencing emotions during the relationship dynamic itself, their feelings often emerge later, after space has been created. This delayed emotional processing is one reason why emotional withdrawal can activate curiosity inside the avoidant mind. When someone who consistently pursued, reassured, or emotionally engaged suddenly becomes less available, the avoidant loses access to a familiar emotional structure. The relationship no longer feels predictable. That shift creates psychological space for reflection. During active emotional pursuit, avoidants are often focused on regulating discomfort rather than analyzing the relationship deeply. Their attention goes toward reducing pressure, protecting independence, or escaping emotional overwhelm. But once the emotional intensity fades and the other person stops chasing, the avoidance nervous system makes. Why finally relax enough to process what the relationship actually meant to them? This is where curiosity begins. Silence and absence create contrast, and contrast forces the brain to notice what was previously taken for granted. The avoidant may start wondering why communication changed, why emotional access disappeared, or why the person who once seemed constantly available is suddenly emotionally distant themselves. Even if they do not openly admit it, the absence creates mental activity. Avoidants are especially vulnerable to delayed emotional comparison. Once distance exists, they begin comparing present emotional emptiness to past emotional comfort. They may start remembering conversations, routines, affection, support, or emotional consistency they previously overlooked while focused on protecting their space. What once felt emotionally overwhelming may now feel emotionally valuable because the nervous system is no longer reacting to immediate pressure. This delayed reflection can become surprisingly intense because avoidants often suppress emotional awareness for long periods of time. Once emotional space removes the immediate stress response, buried emotions begin surfacing gradually. Questions appear internally. Did I push them too far away? Why do I suddenly miss them? Why does the silence feel strange? Why do I keep thinking about them now that they are no longer chasing me? These thoughts are not always expressed outwardly, but they frequently exist beneath the surface. The avoidant may also begin emotionally reevaluating the relationship itself. During periods of emotional closeness, avoidants sometimes focus heavily on flaws, imperfections, or reasons to create distance because their nervous system is trying to reduce emotional vulnerability. But once the relationship energy disappears, their perspective can shift. The brain naturally reevaluates things differently in absence than it does during emotional pressure. This does not guarantee every avoidant suddenly becomes emotionally transformed or ready for a healthy relationship. Curiosity is not the same as emotional maturity. Reflection alone does not automatically create accountability, communication skills, or emotional consistency. However, emotional withdrawal often creates the first real opportunity for internal questioning, because it interrupts the cycle that allowed emotional avoidance to continue comfortably. For the person who steps back, this process is important to understand because many people mistakenly assume the avoidant never cared at all. In reality, avoidants may care deeply but struggle to access, process, and express those emotions while emotionally activated. Their emotional timeline often functions differently. Feelings arrive late. Awareness arrives late. Reflection arrives late. At the same time, emotional withdrawal benefits more than just the avoidant. It also allows the other person to regain emotional clarity. Constant emotional pursuit. It keeps people trapped in anxiety, overanalysis, and emotional exhaustion. But distance creates room for self-respect, emotional balance, and perspective. Whether the avoidant becomes curious or not, stepping back breaks the unhealthy emotional cycle. And ironically, it is often in the silence, after emotional pressure disappears, that the avoidant finally begins asking the questions they were too emotionally defended to ask before. Self-respect changes relationship power because people unconsciously respond to the emotional energy others bring into a relationship. When someone constantly seeks validation, reassurance, attention, or emotional approval from another person, the relationship slowly becomes emotionally unbalanced. One person begins chasing connection while the other controls distance. Over time, this imbalance creates emotional exhaustion, anxiety, and a loss of personal identity. The relationship starts revolving around fear of abandonment instead of mutual emotional stability. This is especially common in relationships involving avoidant personalities. The more emotionally unavailable the avoidant becomes, the more the other person often sacrifices their own peace trying to restore connection. They overthink messages, wait anxiously for replies, tolerate inconsistent behavior, and continuously attempt to prove their worth. Without realizing it, they slowly begin abandoning themselves in order to keep emotional access to someone else. But the moment self-respect returns, the entire dynamic begins to change. Self-respect is not arrogance, revenge, or emotional coldness. It is the decision to stop betraying your own emotional well-being for the sake of maintaining an unhealthy connection. It means recognizing that your value does not decrease simply because someone else struggles to provide consistency, communication, or emotional availability. When a person reaches this understanding, they stop operating from desperation and start operating from emotional balance. This shift is powerful because emotional energy is highly visible even without words. Human beings constantly read emotional signals through behavior, tone, boundaries, body language, and emotional reactions. When someone is emotionally dependent on validation, it often shows through anxious pursuit, emotional over-explaining, constant availability, or fear-based behavior. But when someone develops self-respect, those behaviors naturally begin disappearing. They stop begging for attention. They stop chasing inconsistent people. They stop tolerating emotional breadcrumbs. They stop measuring their worth through someone else's responses. Instead, they begin focusing on their own growth, emotional health, goals, routines, confidence, and peace of mind. And psychologically, this changes how others perceive them. Avoidants especially notice this shift because they are highly sensitive to emotional pressure and dependency. When someone constantly seeks reassurance from the avoidant nervous system often feels trapped or overwhelmed. But when that same person becomes emotionally grounded and self-focused, the emotional pressure disappears. The dynamic suddenly feels different. This does not mean the avoidant immediately transforms or suddenly becomes emotionally healthy, but emotional stability tends to create curiosity and respect in ways desperation never does. Calm confidence communicates strength without needing constant explanation. It shows that your emotional state is no longer entirely controlled by someone else's attention or withdrawal. There is also something psychologically important about emotional independence. People naturally value what feels emotionally secure and self-contained. Someone who respects themselves sends a nonverbal message that they will not tolerate ongoing emotional imbalance forever. They are connected to themselves, not just attached to another person. That energy changes the relationship completely because it removes the unhealthy power imbalance created by constant pursuit. Many people misunderstand relationship power. Real power is not manipulation, control, or making someone jealous. Real power is emotional self-control. It is the ability to remain grounded even when another person becomes inconsistent. It is maintaining your dignity instead of emotionally collapsing every time someone withdraws attention. That level of emotional stability creates strength because it prevents your identity from becoming dependent on external validation. Self-respect also protects mental and emotional health. When people continuously chase emotionally unavailable individuals, they often develop anxiety, self-doubt, emotional burnout, and obsession. Their focus narrows completely onto the relationship. But once they redirect energy back toward personal growth, clarity slowly returns. They begin rebuilding confidence, routines, friendships, ambitions, and emotional balance outside the relationship itself. Ironically, this is often the moment when others begin seeing them differently. Not because they became manipulative or unavailable, but because they stopped radiating emotional desperation. They became emotionally centered. They regained their sense of self, and that is why self-respect changes relationship power so dramatically. The moment you stop begging for love, attention, or emotional consistency from someone unwilling to provide it, You communicate something powerful without saying a single word. Your peace, value, and identity no longer depend on being chosen by someone emotionally unavailable. The goal is not revenge, it is emotional freedom. This is one of the most important truths people eventually learn after emotionally exhausting relationships, especially relationships involving avoidant personalities. When someone feels ignored, rejected, emotionally abandoned, or psychologically confused for long periods of time, it is natural to want validation in return. Many people, please secretly hope the avoidant will finally realize their value, regret losing them, or experience the same emotional pain they caused. But staying emotionally focused on making another person suffer keeps you psychologically tied to the very dynamic that hurt you in the first place. Revenge is still emotional attachment. It may look different than love or longing, but it keeps your attention emotionally locked onto the other person. Your emotions continue revolving around their reactions, their regret, their pain, or their realization. In other words, they still control your emotional state. Real healing begins when your peace no longer depends on whether someone finally understands your worth. This is why emotional freedom matters so much more than emotional victory. Emotional freedom means reclaiming your mind from constant obsession, overthinking, anxiety, and emotional dependency. It means waking up without immediately checking for messages, replaying conversations, or analyzing someone else's behavior all day long. It means your nervous system slowly stops living in survival mode. You no longer feel emotionally controlled by someone's inconsistency, silence, or emotional withdrawal. For many people, relationships with avoidance become emotionally addictive because the inconsistency creates psychological instability. Moments of closeness feel intensely rewarding, while moments of distance create anxiety and emotional craving. Over time, people stop focusing on whether the relationship is healthy and start focusing only on restoring emotional connection. Their self-worth becomes tied to earning attention, reassurance, or affection from someone emotionally unavailable. This is where emotional freedom becomes necessary. The healthiest outcome is not proving your value to someone who could not consistently recognize it. The healthiest outcome is rebuilding your relationship with yourself. It is reconnecting with the version of you that existed before emotion. Exhaustion consumed your thoughts, confidence, and peace. Emotional freedom means learning that your identity cannot depend entirely on another person's emotional capacity. Avoidants often struggle with closeness because intimacy activates fear, vulnerability, and emotional discomfort inside them. Understanding this can create compassion, but compassion should never become self-abandonment. Many people stay trapped because they keep trying to rescue, fix, heal, or emotionally reach someone who continuously withdraws. In the process, they slowly ignore their own emotional needs, boundaries, and mental health. Freedom begins when you stop sacrificing your emotional stability for the hope of changing someone else. This does not mean becoming bitter, cold, or emotionally unavailable yourself. Emotional freedom is not emotional numbness. It is emotional balance. It is the ability to care without losing yourself. It is knowing that you can love someone deeply while still recognizing who and the relationship is harming your mental and emotional well-being. One of the most powerful shifts happens when you stop asking, "How do I make them miss me?" and start asking, "Why did I accept emotional inconsistency for so long?" That question redirects attention back where it belongs, toward your own healing and growth. Instead of obsessing over another person's behavior, you begin strengthening your own boundaries, self-awareness, confidence, and emotional resilience. And ironically, this is often when your energy changes completely. You stop radiating desperation and start radiating stability. You no longer chase, beg, over-explain, or seek constant reassurance. Your emotional state becomes more grounded because it is no longer entirely dependent on another person's availability. Whether the avoidant eventually reflects, regrets, or reaches out becomes less important over time. Why? Because emotional freedom creates something far more valuable than temporary validation: inner peace. You begin sleeping better, thinking clearer, and feeling emotionally lighter. Your life starts expanding again beyond the relationship dynamic that once consumed your attention. The truth is, some avoidants may eventually realize what they lost. Some may experience delayed reflection, curiosity, or regret once emotional distance becomes real. But if your happiness still depends on that realization happening, you are not fully free yet. Freedom means your healing continues regardless of what they choose to do. At its core, emotional freedom is about reclaiming ownership of your emotional world. It is realizing that your peace, confidence, and value cannot remain trapped inside someone else's ability to love consistently. The greatest victory is not making another person suffer the way you suffered. The greatest victory is becoming emotionally healthy enough that you no longer need revenge to feel whole again.